Did you want to say anything else about Acts 2, Gary or Gabe?
Well, no, I think that covers it. It's just the basics of the speaking in tongues, right? What is speaking in tongues? Why is it important? And what does it entail? Is it just Peter speaking to himself in random utterances, or is it actually understood by people? And it's understood by people.
So it was given at the birth of the church, right? It was given to put forth the gospel to people from all over the world so that they could understand it and carry it back to where they came from. That's right. It was a miracle of hearing. Now let's look at the theological purposes for tongues. And Gary, this is your expertise. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 through 14.
Sure. One of the things about Corinthians is you've got to go back and ask what the whole purpose of Corinthians is. And the whole purpose of the book of 1 Corinthians is to correct errors in the church.
That's correct.
And so when you look at spiritual gifts in in 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, Paul is addressing the issue of abusing spiritual gifts, including the gift of tongues. So you have the proper use of tongues in Acts 2. In Corinth, you have the improper use of tongues, and that is what Paul addresses. And that's what I believe is typically the current situation in our churches today that insist on tongues.
The book of Corinthians, you said Paul addresses abuses within the church. They abused the gift of sex that God gave. Yeah. They abused the Lord's table. They abused leaders who were leading the church, preferring one over another. And here they're abusing the gifts. In this case, we're looking specifically at the use of tongues.
Yes, seems like a pattern. Seems like a little bit of a pattern there.
It is a pattern. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14:6, but now, brothers, he's speaking to Christians, if I come to you speaking in tongues, and this was the point that you made earlier in our conversations, Gabe, when you came to my house. What will I profit you unless I speak to you either by way of revelation or of knowledge or of prophecy or of teaching? What's Paul really saying in that verse?
I can grab it. Speaking in tongues, by revelation, knowledge, or prophecy, of teaching. What's the use of tongues if you're not learning anything? What's the use of tongues if I'm just speaking random syllables, right? It's got to profit you somewhere. It's got to profit you for edification, for teaching, right? It's just not random words thrown out there.
It's not some heavenly language that people don't understand in the congregation that need an interpreter for it. He says here, what good is that if I can't speak to you some revelation that you need to hear, some knowledge that you need to know, some prophecy that's going to come forth in your life, or teaching?
Yeah, he's very adamant in this section, talking about, I would rather speak as a prophet so that you would understand what I'm saying, rather than speak thousands of words in tongues that you don't understand. Yep. So he's very clear.
I think it's important to understand that Paul's over here speaking new revelation. Even if somebody can speak in tongues nowadays, which is not the case, we're going to look at that in the future, we're not bringing forth new revelation. All we can do is interpret the revelation God's already given us through Scripture. We're not bringing anything new to the table. All we are is just repeating what Paul's already said and trying to interpret that the best we can.
I know.
Right. What we already have through Paul's writings and through the rest of the apostles' writings in the Old Testament is sufficient for us to live the Christian life fully.
Yep,
right?
Scripture's enough. Yep.
Scripture says that in 1 Peter and 1 Timothy 2:15, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. And so the Bible is complete. We don't need anything else. Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 13 and beyond, he says, therefore let one who speaks in a tongue pray that he may interpret. What's the most abused thing in the church today when it comes to speaking in tongues? Interpretation.
Interpretation,
There isn't none. There's no interpretation.
Yeah.
In verse 19, he says, in the church I desire to speak 5 words with my mind so that I may instruct others also, rather than 10,000 words in a tongue. Wow, if that doesn't say it all, I don't know what does.